cloud.
All right, everyone.
Of the
We're going to go
permission
ahead and
parties.
get started.
Yeah.
Let's just say a group of bands.
So I'm gonna make sure. It seems like you can hear us. Okay. So my name is Lori Echevarria. I'm going to be the moderator today, and I'm a partner at WilmerHale. Before I was at WilmerHale, I was at the SEC in Los Angeles for 15 years in their enforcement division. And when I left, I had been the head of the enforcement division in Los Angeles for 3 years. And I'm also one of the leading members of the Cryptocurrency and ICOs working group at the firm. And so I'm glad to be speaking with you today. I'm also glad to introduce the panelists. At the far end, we have Victoria Libin. She is a director of legal services at Accenture and leads a group of lawyers helping Accenture and its clients to adopt cutting-edge technology, including blockchain, and has a lot to say about the opportunities for blockchain going forward. Next, Andrew Pugnas. He's a partner at Bryan Cave and leader of the commercial practice team, and he works a lot on issues involving cutting-edge technology and its uses in various business applications, including both crypto and blockchain. And then immediately to my left is Aran Kahana. He's an attorney at Maslon LLP and a research fellow here at Stanford Law School and counsels clients on all matters of technology issues, including, of course, the topics for this panel. So this is an overview of where we're going to go today. We're going to start with just a basic introduction on blockchain and cryptocurrency. Often we find it's good to level set and get all the definitions out there. Then we're going to talk about blockchain and distributed ledger use cases, the opportunities to use blockchain and distributed ledger in a variety of ways in industries. Then we'll focus a little bit on cryptocurrencies and ICOs and the regulatory interest and scrutiny surrounding that area. And finally, we'll do a crystal ball roundtable of the future of blockchain and cryptocurrencies as we currently see it. So blockchain and cryptocurrency basics. Victoria, why don't you get us started?
So at its core, blockchain and distributed ledgers, and often those terms are used interchangeably, are basically a database. They're a system of entries of data maintained by various participants in a network. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are probably some of the first use cases and examples of it, but there can be many uses, and we'll get into those a little bit later. There's generally a distinction between public and private blockchains. Public blockchains are completely distributed peer-to-peer databases that use complex, cryptography to validate transactions, and private blockchains or distributed ledgers are basically hosted by a known group of actors with certain permissions. That's a very basic definition.
Thank you. And now we're going to give a basic definition of cryptocurrency. Aran?
Well, cryptocurrency, as John Oliver said, is everything you don't know about money combined with everything you don't know about computers. And that's really all you need to know. Well, you've all heard of Bitcoin. That's not anything new. It's the value of the currency is constantly fluctuating. Somebody told me this morning that it drastically dropped today, so I have not heard. If somebody,
it's about 6,500 on my last Coinbase access. So.
It was worth $72 billion last year, so there is definitely an enormous amount of value. But the idea of having something like a cryptocurrency for lawyers is very intriguing because it creates a situation where transactions that would normally be scrutinized quite heavily become potentially quite invisible in terms of its scrutiny, and we will get into that a little bit more later in terms of the regulatory aspects.
All right. And then to talk about ICOs generally, Andrew.
Sure. Most people have probably heard the term ICO or ICO, it's a somewhat unfortunate. It's a somewhat unfortunate designation, although I think it was an intentional one by probably bad actors. What ICO or ICO stands for is an initial coin offering, which is, of course, the proprietor of a cryptocurrency solution offering tokens, or perhaps offering the right to buy tokens, cryptographic tokens that function on the network for the first time. Some ICOs are offered very broadly to the public. Some are offered to a designated whitelist, which may be in very compliant and conservative cases, accredited investors or the foreign equivalents of those laws, or other known participants. In other cases, an offeror may enable a whitelist to be sort of an application process generally to the public, but fundamentally it's very similar to an initial public offering from a securities perspective, whereby the assets are offered to the public for the first time. There's a lot of examples of that. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of coins out there. Ripple pre-mining approximately 1 billion of their XRP tokens was one example. Ether, of course, was 18 million. And then we'll talk a little bit later about the DAO as opposed to a DAO, which was a $150 million raise, which really didn't end so well. So.
Yep. All right. So now we're going to dive into talking about the blockchain and distributed ledger and the various exciting, interesting uses for that. And so we're going to do a deep dive here for a little bit, and everyone will weigh in with their experiences, what they're seeing, and what the opportunities may be in this expanding space. Victoria, why don't you get us started?
All right. Next slide, if you don't mind. Thank you. So this is a slide that I often use to try to explain blockchain to those that are not technically minded. Everybody can wrap their head around the idea that we had paper records, right? The traditional book, where you had debits and credits. Then we moved to a centralized database, basically, digital filing cabinet of sorts. And then now we've got the distributed ledger blockchain, where the idea is that the records are duplicated amongst many nodes, peer-to-peer network, and many parties can also write to that, database. Next slide, please. So this is a definition we use a lot at Accenture. We already talked about what a distributed ledger is, which is a record of transactions where there's no centralized party in control. The idea is that it's a single source of truth. It enables a shared database across an entire value chain or network and acts as a single source of truth for those outside of a circle of trust. And again, as I referenced earlier, it uses cryptography and digital signatures to ensure authenticity and proof of authenticity, and also to controlled read-write access controls. Another advantage of blockchain is that because the data is distributed across several nodes, there is no single point of failure. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but the idea is that the data is replicated and carried through a lot of different blocks that live on the distributed ledger or blockchain. Permission versus, what is a permission blockchain? In some cases, you don't want, the whole world to be able to host a node. You don't know who those actors are. You get into know your customer issues, et cetera. You want to basically have only a group of known actors. For example, it could be a group of banks. It could be a group of shipping companies if you're dealing with, supply chain, et cetera. There's maybe not a lot of trust, but there's more trust than if it was open to the world the way that Bitcoin is, where, everybody can, who hosts a node gets to mine Bitcoins in exchange for, their computer processing. Here, the idea is that all these known actors in an ecosystem agree to host the nodes. There's other benefits to them, such as lower transaction costs, et cetera. So there's no need to mine a currency or, remunerate them in any other way.
Yeah. I think it's a more and more important distinction as the sort of blockchain / distributed / decentralized world becomes a reality, because I think more and more in my practice, where I represent, sort of a mix of startups and, large banks, large retailers, et cetera, large logistics companies who are using blockchain systems, as Victoria mentioned, there's more and more issues. There are innumerable issues, particularly for a bank, in allowing data regarding the bank's transactions to live in a public repository that everybody can see. On the other hand, something like Bitcoin, which is intended to be an exchange of value, or Ether, which is intended to be a public network that enables the execution of smart contracts. There's values in it being public. There's values in it being available and transparent for everybody to see. On the other hand, more and more companies want to take advantage of the efficiencies created by no points of failure, a single source of truth that can be accessed by all participants in a network. So I guess just as in all of your practice, it's a very important distinction to understand that blockchain systems can live on a cloud that is limited to a few banks, a few logistics companies, even a company and its suppliers, and there's ways to implement blockchain technology that's not, let's all put on a unicorn hat and go to Burning Man and have everything available for the world to see. So just an important, bad joke, but an important distinction.
And you raised a concept, smart contracts, also. So let's break that down just for a moment in this space. Victoria, you want to talk about those?
So a smart contract really is just a form of executable code that's going to execute against data parameters that live on the blockchain. It's an if this, then that. So for example, let's take the case in supply chain or shipping. Once the purchaser of goods signs for receipt of the goods, there can be a smart contract on that blockchain that originated from the moment the seller put the goods through the bill of lading in the shipping container, et cetera, that says once receipt and acknowledge, I pay X. So now you have a signature. There could be basically a call to the data to the bank that auto executes the payment once the goods are received. So that's all it is. It's not really a contract. It's actually kind of a misnomer. It's just executable code.
Great. So next.
So again, the reason why blockchain is getting so much hype these days is because it really does, provide the potential for imagining a world where things can be traceable. Some of the use cases that we've seen are tracing anything from wildlife to diamonds to produce to certify that it's organic. I mean, there's ways to represent with a token, what a physical good is in a digital representation and trace it all across the supply chain. There's certainty, there's transparency in that all the parties in a permission blockchain can see the recorded data as it gets inputted into the blockchain. Fast settlement in real time, where, as I mentioned, you can literally receive goods, send payment. There's a lot of streamlining and cutting of middlemen and data clearinghouses. And again, it allows you potentially to even do asset management in terms of even something like software entitlements to ensure that parties are not overstepping the bounds of licenses. I'm not going to spend a ton of time in this slide, but just know that there is a decision tree for when and when not you should use a blockchain. Blockchain is not, a panacea for everything. You're probably going to have clients that heard about blockchain, get all excited about, say, oh, I want to use blockchain. What this comes down to is you really want blockchain when there is no trust between parties, or some trust but not perfect trust. And you want to disintermediate the middlemen who tend to act as the arbiter of trust, whether it's clearinghouses, et cetera, or when you really need kind of, a single source of truth or traceability. If you don't have those, then you don't need a blockchain.
Yeah.
And Andrew, I wanted to turn to you for a moment to see if you have clients who are calling you and asking questions that kind of would feed into this decision tree, or in other ways that you would advise them about whether blockchain makes sense to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a few examples, both in my practice and that I've seen in the marketplace. I guess in many cases, it's not necessarily a blockchain use case decision tree. It can often be an ICO or coin offering based decision tree. For example, I had an overseas game publisher who wanted to do an ICO, and then when the rubber met the road and we focused on what the client's actual goals were, they really wanted their players on their various networks of games to switch one digital asset in one game for another one within their own asset. There's actually already, it's known as Wax. It's actually based in Santa Monica, which is where I'm based as well, which is indeed a token that's based around the exchange of digital assets with for game players. So there was an opportunity to perhaps list or accept those tokens. As we've drilled down further into the project, it became apparent that they really just wanted to use, coins as a customer retention model, and we figured out a pretty quick and clever way that assets in one game, be it a magic sword or thinking about my 4-year-old daughter, her costumes for her dog named Mrs. Hollywood. When she was finished with one game, to be able to exchange those into coins and be able to use them elsewhere, and we to cut to the chase on a very long regulatory analysis, we determined that as long as these tokens stayed within the company's platform, they couldn't be exchanged for real money or cryptocurrencies or anything of value. So, that's one example of how perhaps a client's goals or the client's stated goals, which are really to be a part of the hype and be a part of the new world, might not necessarily require the sorts of regulatory deep dives we'll talk about in a minute. Another one that's very interesting that you see in the marketplace was, I don't know if anybody, maybe someone here represented them, but the Baycoin that Oscar Mayer came out with, which is a cryptocurrency that was exchangeable for slices of bacon. Of course, loving both bacon and loving new technology, I was obviously very interested in that. And when digging into that particular offering, it was obvious that it was not positioned as an ICO or even a private sale of a token or really even blockchain necessarily. It was a contest where you could receive a digital asset and exchange it for bacon, and the company Oscar Mayer would more or less arbitrarily allow the value of the token to go up or down to determine how many packs of bacon you could get. And being one of the few people in the world that actually reads offers, terms, and conditions, it became apparent that it was a contest or a promotion, and sweepstakes and promotional lawyers were quite busy putting together appropriate rules. But I think the takeaway is there are ways to capitalize on marketing hype and public interest in ways that don't require, say, getting money transmission licenses or complex compliance with securities laws. So two examples there. Yeah.
Great. All right. I think there we go. We have the blockchain transforming business models. And this gives you some sense of what everyone's been talking about in terms of the consolidation that can be possible and how blockchain can make a more efficient ecosystem. And then, Victoria, you want to talk about the value chain?
Here's another one. I kind of alluded to this in the supply chain management, but here's, for example, auto manufacturing life cycle, right? Any auto manufacturer produces a vehicle and assigns it usually a VIN number. Imagine that VIN number now is logged onto a blockchain ledger at the manufacturer. As the vehicle is shipped to resellers, distributors, and sold to owners, the change of ownership can immediately be tracked on that blockchain. Things like service, maintenance, whether the vehicle's in an accident, are recorded. There's no doubt when you're trying to buy that used vehicle back. So the entire history of that vehicle now is recorded and tamper-proof.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about these systems, and I was in a pretty lengthy presentation with one of your competitors in the space, obviously an inferior one.
That's very kind of you.
One piece that's often sort of glazed over and we're not glazing over it here, I'm bringing it up, but just the actual logging. I mean, blockchain is not an end-all, be-all, cure-all, as you've said, for anything. I mean, like any data system or data structure, the garbage in, garbage out principle applies. And actually, in terms of the technology solutions on the marketplace, the actual logging in of the data is kind of an underrated piece of things. And I've had, being fundamentally a sourcing lawyer and very interested in value of all kinds. One of the questions that came to my mind is what technology do you need to actually log it in? And it turns out the client has to
We spend a lot of time creating what we call the UX,
Yes.
UI design, which is basically usually both a web app and a mobile app in order to be able to enter data and view data.
Right.
With obviously, access controls and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, because you need, and actually they have to be robust, because sometimes somebody in an auto plant or a banana farm or in a warehouse environment where it's not necessarily as conducive to careful data entry needs to be done. So it's an interesting piece of the puzzle, and I think an important question for lawyers to ask.
It's also integration with systems like barcode and UDID systems, right, to integrate with them so that that type of data can automatically be scanned into the ledger. But that requires, again, data interfaces and some level of upfront development.
Yeah.
And those kinds of applications together with the smart contracts is where the IP battles are going to be fought.
Right. Do you find that, certainly my clients expect to own UI and UX that are very tagged to their supply chain and logistics models.
Right, and then it becomes a battle, like how much are we bringing in that's
Right.
pre-existing, right? If we've already figured out the logic to a lot of this, and it just needs to be adapted to, and integrated with, say, a client's back-end systems, or is it something that we're developing from scratch?
All right, and so we want to also talk about some of the broad range of emerging uses for blockchain with more specificity now that you've heard a little bit about how it can be used and what kinds of decisions to consider in thinking about whether to employ blockchain. So Iran, why don't you talk through some of the emerging uses?
I would direct your attention to the boxes that talk about identity, asset management, and customer data, and really think about those concepts within the framework of cybersecurity. The advantages of blockchain in the sense of its certainty, traceability, transparency, the asset management, all of those things are themes that we can trace into contemporary cybersecurity issues that we are struggling with and need to look at as either as outside counsel or in-house counsel. And if you think about just the one of the main sources of cybersecurity guidance, which is the NIST 800-53, half of what of the identity management tasks in 800-53 relate or can be tied to the use of blockchain. And we can even drill down further and see that even HIPAA, though HIPAA doesn't talk about blockchain, but at least the administrative safeguards and the technical safeguards within HIPAA are implicated and potentially benefited from the use of blockchain. Identity management is also a key issue for any organization that is looking to manage its cybersecurity ecosystem. And we are seeing really a growth in the area of regulation in different sectors. For example, the New York Department of Financial Services, we had a conference in late April where we talked about NYDFS and its and the cybersecurity implications here at the law school. And when you look at what NYDFS requires and you drill down to some of those regulations, and you see that a key undertaking that organizations need to take relates to risk assessment. And the risk assessment, as a key aspect of risk assessment, is identity management. How do you know who you're dealing with? And that touches on a lot of different tasks that organizations need to undertake in their cybersecurity management. We are also everybody here should know or should have already heard of GDPR and knows that we are living under the world of GDPR and identity management. You can imagine how important that is under that regulation. And so that too benefits from blockchain. So if you're in-house or an outside lawyer advising businesses on risk assessments, compliance with various different cybersecurity regulations, the understanding of how blockchain implementation, of what that infrastructure means with particular respect to the undertaking of those tasks becomes very important. I'll just mention one more thing about we talk about the protecting the identity or managing identity of individuals, managing the identity of assets, but blockchain is also important for managing the integrity of information. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the crystal ball segment. But it is very important in applications that require the integrity of the information to be basically untouchable. Then you want to be taking a serious look at blockchain. And if your business people are not bringing that up as a case of an implementation, then it's something I think as in-house or as an outside lawyer, you should be bringing up the question of, are we considering blockchain? And if not, why?
So here's another example that goes through raw materials and how blockchain can help overcome certain key challenges in the supply chain.
Right, and here too, the example of the coffee, I'm not, aside from the fact that I have invested thousands of dollars, particularly probably more in Starbucks just this last week. The concept of track and trace, I think, are some of the more intriguing aspects of why you would use a blockchain. As the coffee beans travel from start to finish, you want to know either I think as a seller, also as a buyer, that you want to know that they are compliant, that what is happening is compliant with the legal framework that you've established in the contract. And when you can take out the concept of trust, I don't have to trust the party I'm dealing with. It's all about proof. Then it makes it a lot easier to deal with. So when you're thinking, and last year Victoria and I were on a panel, maybe even in this room, we were talking about things going in containers over the ocean for weeks and weeks, and being able to validate without any room for argument that the temperature controls in this particular container were what they were supposed to be or what they were said to be in the contract. That has very significant value, and you can see that a blockchain implementation for that, it makes sense.
Right. It's an interesting interface, IoT, with blockchain, and I think one of the reasons it's interesting is the garbage in, garbage out problem. If a machine is creating the entries, and obviously they're validated by consensus from inputs from other machines, theoretically, at least that's infallible. Although, again, as a commercial and sourcing lawyer, I always think, well, what if the sensors are not functioning properly, and who's responsible for that? And I think one takeaway, just as a deal lawyer, is, probably when push comes to shove, blockchain technology is probably less apt to error and creates many efficiencies. But when there are errors, the errors are big and multiply very quickly, and I think you get into some interesting discussions about who's responsible for that.
Right. From what I understand, the errors in blockchain are typically not technical; they are typically human.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the issue or the mechanisms for dealing with human error, or what happens, how do you manage the human element or the human variable in your contracting environment, which has blockchain? It's just best practices of managing the human element and ensuring that you have good identity management systems in place where only certain people are allowed certain access and so forth.
So we have a question, actually, and I'm glad to have questions, so please.
Yeah. So thanks very much, Joseph DeMarco from DeMarco in New York. One question that I had, getting right to this point, is not so much the vulnerability of the chain and the technology itself, but I'm just curious, has anyone given any thought to the impact of, say, off-ledger events and off-ledger transactions had up there, which I think is a great example, the potential use in the auto industry, right? Car rolls off the assembly line, been tagged, service recall a year later, person brings it back to the dealership, okay, that airbag, whatever, was fixed, et cetera and so forth. You, in theory, over the life of the vehicle, which could be 20 years, have a great chain of title as to the vehicle's service. But not everyone brings their car into a service dealership or even any kind of mechanic that has computers, let's say. I mean, you could bring it to the corner service person who could either make or not make the change. And that will have happened, right? But it will not have been logged and will not have been part of the ledger. So I'm just wondering, has anyone given any thought leadership to the fact of how we're going as lawyers to address the off-ledger piece of this in light of the fact that we're also going to be very focused on the reliability of it? I'm wondering if there maybe isn't a little bit too much overconfidence built around the robustness of the technology that we're going to have to face as lawyers.
I absolutely agree with the overconfidence, and that was exactly my point with the UI UX build. Is ultimately someone in a in a rough coffee plantation is going to have a mobile device or scanner and go beep beep beep. And I totally agree with you. I guess in terms of how do you account for these things or who's responsible? I mean, it depends on a lot of things. I mean, I think one area, I think there are some blockchain implementations where there are a tight group of nodes, or maybe more correctly, network members who are used to doing things in a highly regulatory environment. For example, banks and implementing RippleNet, which and some of the other ones that you see, R3s and so forth. I think those environments, there'd probably have to be inter-parties agreements or maybe consensus documents saying all transactions must be logged, et cetera, and you're responsible if you don't do it. I mean, I think it would be very, very hard as lawyers to say, well, to have some magical way to validate that no off-chain repairs were done. And I think the solution would probably have to come from technology. Maybe there's a sensor that goes off every time a piece of a dashboard is taken off. Maybe maybe there's a lot of sensors. Anytime anything is touched, it happens. And I think it is going to have. I think there's a layer of technology, part of it's IoT, part of it's UI UX, that's going to have to overlay or underlay, depending on what analogy you like, the system as part of solving, again, the garbage in, garbage out problem.
So part of the thing we're doing here at Stanford and looking at the IoT side of things, and in fact, autonomous vehicles, is it's not so much the oil change, I think, but taking the principle or the example of the oil change, and if there is a change to the vehicle or the device that is not within the realm of approved transactions, and the example you gave would be one that is an externality. This is not something that has been approved. So to Andrew's point, this would be something that triggers an anomaly, and that anomaly is recorded. And so the question then is, for the business side, is this anomaly a breach? And if it is do we care? Or is it, what are the damages really? Or if they're none, then who cares? Move on.
Yeah.
I think, your question is going to, and the solution to it is going to vary use case by use case, and, the group of ecosystem players by ecosystem players. And as we're seeing, private permission blockchains emerge, like within banks, within a group of supply chain shippers, et cetera, there are going to be foundational agreements between those parties that deal or try to deal with these issues and adapt as the use cases become more mature. It's going to be, it's not going to be, once and done. It's going to be iterative and constant, adjustments as the technology matures.
All right. Another question, real quick.
Before we move on, so blockchain is a database. How is it, from a technological standpoint, different from other distributed databases that exist today already?
Without getting too much in the weeds, and for that I'd recommend people spend some time either on CoinDesk or some other journals, it's the use of very advanced cryptography that helps make it, a single source of truth, tamper-proof, and provides the traceability.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the legal and regulatory issues surrounding blockchain generally. In a little bit, we will get into the specific use of blockchain in the cryptocurrency and ICO space and talk about those regulatory issues separately. But let's focus on big picture first. Ron?
So I think, again, I spent 11 years as an in-house lawyer, and now I'm an outside lawyer. And my work, I think, tends to be the same, is asking the business people why you're doing what you're doing, not just accepting it as a infallible truth that they know that they are doing something and there is no other way to do it, and just testing that out. And if nothing else, you could keep this, make this slide into a little card you bring with you to any meeting. And in fact, these issues are true for anything that you are really doing or that we do in our day-to-day work. When we are dealing with a blockchain implementation, the first issues are, when we're thinking about confidentiality and privacy, are we selecting the right model? Is it a public one? Is it a permission? What do we have here? What is the type of blockchain model that we are going to be implementing? And what are the potential complications if we use one or the other? And again, you don't have to have all the answers necessarily, but you do have to have a good list of questions to ask, because asking the right questions teases out answers, which teases out issues, which then teases out the solutions, potential solutions. But if you have an application where you understand it to be that we're dealing with confidential information, this is sensitive stuff, and your business people are coming in saying, yeah, we're going to be using a public model, and the alarms should be firing off at that point, and it's not just asking why are we insisting on using a public model instead of a private model. Those type of questions should be coming out very quickly. Worldwide regulation, are there jurisdictions in where blockchains are not permitted? I think that's a complex question to ask, without any particular context in mind. But it is, like anything else we do in our practice, we need to look at the various jurisdictions that are touched by the fact of, or the deal that we're working with, and asking the question, how does blockchain modify the deal that we're doing if we are going to be dealing with that, and how does it change the outcomes of what we want in a particular deal? I think, to me, and I've read enough about this to understand that others in the legal profession are paying attention to how the GDPR is implicated by blockchain, and I think that it's a fair statement to make that the people who drafted GDPR were thinking about legacy computing. They were not thinking about ultra-modern issues. And then and you see that even in modern day contracting, where people talk about deleting data. Once the deal is done, you will delete the data, or even worse, you will return the data. What does that mean? I mean, here's a box of floppies, right? That's not going to happen. So the idea of data erasure and how that fits into a world of blockchain, that's very interesting. Can we really delete data on a blockchain? Do we just throw out the encryption keys? What do we do with this, right? So how does that in practice work? And that may even make the case that your implementation of a blockchain doesn't make sense,
right?
Because of what you're going to do.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. That's just having a practice where often the answer, the questions is, okay, fine, all that's great. What do I need to do today? What do I need to do today? What's the answer today? And my answer is, if you have data that's subject to right to be forgotten or similar requirements, can't live on the blockchain. Maybe the data that's directly relevant to the transactions you're trying to affect. Maybe there's hashing, or things of that nature. Yeah.
I was going to say, there are ways to represent the data with a hash and not actually have the data itself on the blockchain, so that it can be deleted in the part, in the control sort of database, right?
Right.
Also, for example, at Accenture, we developed something that was quite controversial, which was the idea of a redactable blockchain. And we rather think of data on a blockchain as being tamper-proof as opposed to mutable. So the idea is that you can delete the data, you can change the data, but it leaves a scar. It leaves evidence that the data was, messed with on some level.
One could see a system where it was a private blockchain and the consensus mechanisms were such that, or there was indeed a self-executing code that if X request comes in, Y happens, and the SCAR happens. But I think that, particularly as you get deep into the code is law type crowd, yeah, it's offensive because the whole point, and it gets to your really good question, that at what point is a blockchain not a blockchain anymore, right? Yeah.
All right, so I want to move forward. There are, the slide does have a number of regulatory issues that are summarized in this space, and I think the slides are in everyone's materials. So in the interest of moving to a hypothetical that the panelists can discuss applying some of the concepts we've been talking about. So we have up here a hypothetical. Block Health desires to disrupt healthcare by decentralizing patient data and streamlining hospital and insurers' record keeping, resulting in massive savings. So you get an email from a business person who asks about doing a pilot with a network of private hospitals across Europe and 2 sister hospitals in Thailand for patient data and records to avoid misdiagnosis, wrong procedures, and drug interactions. Each hospital is paying $100,000 for a 90-day pilot to prove the concept and viability of blockchain to solve this problem. I need an agreement in a week for the following hospitals, as the POC workshops start in 10 days and will last for a week. There's some more details about the POC blockchain needs to have 10 cloud-hosted nodes in specific countries. During the first week, we need to gather enough requirements to develop smart contracts, and we need the prototype to be ready in 30 days from the workshop start date. There's a list of hospitals that are going to be included in this request. So let's unpack this a little bit and talk about how you would approach a request like this to use blockchain in this context. Iran?
Well, first of all, how do you know this is a completely hypo? How do you know this is a hypo, right? You were given a week to do this.
Yeah.
We need this tomorrow, typically, was my reality. Things didn't take that long. So I think, as we're looking at, go step by step here, again, as I said, the role of counsel is to ask questions. There was a famous comedian who has since fallen into disfavor, who has a fantastic routine that he calls Why. And it's his 4-year-old daughter or 5-year-old daughter asking him why, all the time. And basically, the bottom line there is asking the right questions is an art. And here, this is some of the turning these things into questions really makes the deal structure either good or bad. So what are we going to be using, a permission or completely decentralized blockchain? What is the reason? Actually, I should backtrack. For each one of these questions or for each one of these issues, I think that the right approach is to have a good reason, a reason that you've selected something that makes sense, that you can defend 2 weeks later when the CEO gathers everybody around because something happened. And why was a decision made to do X and not Y? So every one of these, you should be thinking about, why did we make a decision to use a permissioned blockchain model versus a decentralized one? What was the reason that we did this? And in the proof of concept, I cannot imagine that there's a good reason, one that stands to later scrutiny, why you would use a completely decentralized blockchain. There may be a good one, but we're not the ones that come up with the answers. We really are the ones that come up with the questions. How will the platform be governed and decide which hospital can host nodes if decentralized? I think the question is there any reason to exclude anybody? And if we are excluding anybody, well, why are we even entertaining them as a member in this? I would call it a consortium versus a network. If they are, they're paying $100,000. That's great, but they are not really going to be adding anything to this equation. So we don't want anybody that we have a reason to necessarily exclude. And it's not because we don't necessarily trust them. It's because maybe they're in a problematic jurisdiction, which that in of itself erodes and deteriorates the value of the proof of concept. What smart contracts are we developing, and exactly what will they do? I think here we want to make sure that everything is detailed in a statement of work, that we know exactly what's going to happen. The business people should have a clear understanding, a clear vision of what will be happening, and that will help reduce room for dispute. But it's a good way, and having a good spec will ensure that you have a higher chance of a POC
It also
being successful.
speaks to regulatory issues, depending on what exactly the smart contracts do. It may raise regulatory flags.
Right, right. I'll skip the UI. The application interfaces pretty much speaks up for itself. We talked about that too. Who will own the resulting smart contracts, web, mobile apps? I always ask, is there a reason we need to own this? And if not, why not just have some sort of a license structure? Again, if we have a joint ownership structure like in a consortium, you're really licensing it between the parties, and there's really no reason for it ever to be externalized. And if you want to externalize it, we're really just delving into very creative licensing structures that come out of that. But if in a POC, you will really be, you'll end up with smart contract models that are really things that are for that POC, for that particular application. How valuable and how viable are they outside of the consortium? I don't know, but that, again, is a question for the business people. Is there really a need for this to be going outside? Third party open source is always interesting dialogue there. Of course, the issues there, I'm sure you're all aware of copyleft and viral issues. So you have to make sure that you're not going to run into problems down the road. So the IP aspects there are very real. In terms of the data, are we dealing with real or dummy? I'm hard pressed. It would be a wonderful conversation to have with the business people as to why they think they need real data. What is the the economic value, so to speak, of using real data here? You're not getting paid to do this. This is a POC. Why can't we use dummy data? And again, like I said at the outset, make sure you have good reasons for the things you're selecting to do here. Where is the data located? Again, GDPR makes it very clear, and even before GDPR made it very clear that we need to know where the data is. Just that it's in the cloud is not a good answer. You look like an amateur if you say, well, it's in the cloud. You need to know where these things are. Who bears the risk of, it's almost like risk of loss, who bears the risk of the data leading to, corrupt data leading to death or injury? That's maybe probably not a good question to ask. If you're dealing in a POC, you should not have things that lead to death or injury in a POC. I think that the more kind of the more practical question in a POC is to ask, how do we ensure that we have data integrity? Because, of course, the whole reason for using blockchain is that it's not that it's tamper-proof, but it's tamper-evident. And so the issue there is not so much, again, in a POC framework, it's not what will happen when somebody dies. It's how do we address the fact that there's a tampering with the data? And are smart contracts valid in all the jurisdictions where the hospitals are located? I don't think this generally poses a problem, at least in my experience. I think so long as it's very clear that the consortium has agreed to this framework, that the smart contracts that are being agreed to are clearly agreed to, that there's no issue with that happening. So I don't see that as being the issue. But of course, if there is a reason to have any concerns, then just choose a good jurisdiction for yourself. I've done deals where we had a Russian company and an American company, and we agreed to have the jurisdiction be in Switzerland. You can do that.
So it's not this particular hypo, but I have seen situations where, for example, there was talk about doing or using blockchain for real estate transactions, and of course, there was talk about doing it in jurisdictions where real estate transactions had to be in writing, signed by all parties, and notarized on a transaction per transaction basis. So in that case, even though, say, it would be like a group of lawyers and even the government, unless they changed their legislation, there's a little bit of an issue. So that's why, while it may not be applicable in this POC, I think it's always good to have in your back of your
Statute
mind.
of frauds and things like
Yeah.
that are remain valid.
Right.
I think you hit on another important point, which is comes up later, but I think the time's catching up with us. I mean, the space is rapidly becoming non-U.S. centric, and we've actually, as a country, kind of done ourselves a disservice having a fragmented and somewhat aggressive regulatory scheme, particularly, and one that seems to be getting stricter and more difficult. And your point is an excellent one that a lot of times I'm lucky that my firm merged with a London-based firm with offices in Russia and so forth this year, because I've found myself drawing upon resources from the combined firm as well as other firms. So I guess as this conference goes on, if you're outside the United States and England and you're a blockchain lawyer, I'd love to talk, because it just seems, I just got a memo this morning from Portugal. It's interesting how that's such a big trend.
And so that's a perfect segue into what will be a quick coverage of cryptocurrencies and ICOs, because as Andrew points out, there's a lot of restriction in this space going forward. And of course, cryptocurrencies generally are the most well-known and discussed use of blockchain, but they are reliant on a blockchain technology, essentially. And quickly, we had this slide talking about mining, because a couple of the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and Ethereum, and Ripple's moving to this, are using mining, are discovered through mining. And basically, mining is exchanging computing power to solve mathematical problems and create and add blocks to the public ledger blockchain. And through doing so, you obtain a Bitcoin or a Ether or whatever. And so miners have been taking over and moving into places in the United States where there's more ample access to power at cheaper costs.
And cold is free.
And cold because, right, exactly. Having the computer processors to run and the special hardware to run these transactions and actually mine Bitcoin runs very hot. Those computers run extremely hot. There's a high fire risk, actually. And so communities have started regulating and trying to dissuade miners from coming into their communities and taking over all of the cheap power and creating an increased burden on public services like fire, because there is a fire risk to having when miners come together and create, a space where they have a lot of computer hardware running at very high speeds, at very high temperatures. So moving forward, we'll talk now about ICOs. Andrew, if you want to
Sure,
introduce
yeah, I
the
mentioned
topic.
before, again, the somewhat unfortunate name of an initial, or sometimes intentionally unfortunate name of an initial coin offering is the initial sale of a token, often publicly. These were all the rage last year and the year before, and huge amounts of money were raised, sometimes to further legitimate, interesting projects, sometimes intended to further legitimate, interesting projects like what was called the DAO, as opposed to the confusingly named DAOs generally. The DAO was, to just cut to the chase on it, was essentially a crowdsourced venture fund where tokens were raised that would be used to fund other projects that were decided on by the community. There was either an attack or a hack or just somebody who read the rules very carefully and exploited a known feature of the structure to siphon enormous amounts of tokens and therefore money out of the system. The attacker, as they were known as the press, took the relatively speaking, very public position on Reddit and some other outlets of that nature, saying, "What are you talking about? Code is law. I followed the rules. I just read it more carefully than everybody else, and I got this money. By the way, if you come after me, I'm going to sue you." There was, all sorts of rumblings and on and offline, and just where things ended up was the Ethereum Foundation decided to hard fork the code to return the funds, at least most of the funds, to the participants. And I think there was a lot of fallout from it. One was just it led to an increased degree of scrutiny, particularly from securities and regulators. And then the other one, from more of a technical standpoint, was all of a sudden you have this decentralized, autonomous organization that everybody's so proud of, code is law, this, that, and the other thing, and then as soon as something went wrong, a smaller group of people who lost the most money got together and said, hey, we're going to change the rules at the very last second. And people that are very deep on the technical side of things said, what is going on? So it's actually surprising. I mean, that was from a lawyer's perspective surprisingly controversial, but I think from a technologist perspective, the hard fork was surprisingly controversial. As a lawyer, I think that was probably the right decision. So yeah, now that was probably a herald of the beginning of the age that we're in now.
Yep. So we'll move through this pretty quickly. Cryptocurrency regulation, there is no single agency responsible for the oversight of virtual currencies. So it's evolved into this multi-regulatory approach involving the SEC, CFTC, the FTC. The states have taken on their own positions. And of course, FinCEN and Treasury have also looked at at cryptocurrency insofar as it relates to anti-money laundering. So moving through, the question to ask is, when is a digital token or initial coin offering a security or a securities offering? When is it a commodity? And is it currency? I think the SEC has taken the very public position that most digital tokens and ICOs are securities, and they are subject to the securities laws. They took this position actually initially related to the same instance that Andrew was talking about, the DAO. In July of 2017, the SEC's Enforcement Division and the Commission issued what's called a 21A report, which is basically not an actual enforcement action. It is a statement that the SEC can release where it tells the market that they're going to apply the securities laws in a potentially novel or new manner. And so they're basically putting the market on notice as to how they're thinking about an issue. And in the 21A report here, they issued it against the DAO. It was after the hard fork that Andrew talked about, and returning some of the money. And they took the position for the first time that initial coin offerings constitute a securities offering, and a digital token offered for sale is an investment contract under a very old U.S. Supreme Court case, W.J. Howey. And the W.J. Howey test involves, in 4 factors: an investment of money, the held in a common enterprise with an expectation of profit solely from the efforts of others. And they basically applied that, and they have been applying it from that time forward very aggressively to find that virtually any raising of money by an entity in the form of digital tokens, where the purpose is where the entity is putting tokens out on the market, people are giving them money for that. The money is being pooled at the entity. So there's that common use by the entity, and then the investor has an expectation of profit based on the efforts of the entity who put the tokens out on the market. Then they are holding the position that that's a security, and they've opened, dozens of investigations, issued, press reports have said, over 80 subpoenas, and have been pretty aggressive in speeches around saying, we've not registered any ICO as a registered security. We have not registered any exchange that is selling these digital tokens as an exchange. And so if anyone tells you otherwise, beware. Now, there's some debate around whether all digital tokens are necessarily an investment contract under Howey. And one critical issue there, and we're out of time, so I will just say this quickly, is it comes down to the efforts of others. So the question is now hotly debated whether Bitcoin, Ethereum, and mined cryptocurrency constitute securities, because the efforts of the investors in mining generate the value to the investors. And there is no centralized organization in Bitcoin, certainly, that has issued these coins onto the market. Yeah. And so there's a hot debate around this issue. But a digital token being created by a company, the SEC has taken the position pretty clearly and frequently now that is a security. And the materials, unfortunately, running out of time, but the materials go through a number of the cases brought involving ICOs. Most of them on this slide actually are fraud cases where there was no legitimate business. But the one that is of interest to people who are seeking to, who have legitimate businesses and are seeking to use this is the Munchie order. In Munchie, there was a legitimate business. There was an initial coin offering that was made to raise money to improve an iPhone app in food services. And the SEC came in and said it's still an unregistered securities offering. Munchie voluntarily returned all the money that they had raised and settled with the SEC without a penalty.
Lori, do you think that my read of it was the Munchies advertising where they were touting the benefits, or more correctly, the value on the secondary market? Where buy these things now and you can resell them for a lot of money later.
Yeah, no.
To me, that was just a dagger in the heart.
Yeah, that is. I think that's exactly right. Like where you're creating an investment, like an investment opportunity for people, and trying to raise money to do so. That is going to be the heart of a security. And they have said they're not looking at the form; they're going to look at the substance, what's actually happening in the transaction. And so, if it looks like an IPO, an initial public offering, but it's with coins, it's going to be considered, a security by the SEC. The CFTC has been in the space. The FTC has been in the space. So there's been a lot of legal developments on this. It would be good to do a quick crystal ball. So we'll start at the end and move forward and try to keep it quick. The speed round. Quick sentence on what you think the future holds in this space.
I think there's going to be a lot more private permission blockchain use cases that's going to proliferate. And I think the interest in ICOs in cryptocurrencies is probably going to die down, with the exception of potentially some banks creating, fiat cryptocurrencies. And we're starting to see that in some countries.
Yeah, for me, I think we've got to get to something around an exception to securities offerings for utility tokens, even if the network has to be operated. We see that work in other countries. Sadly, I think this space is going to, as I mentioned earlier, going to continue to drift ex-US. I think in the financial services area, and particularly in Asia, you have things called regulatory sandboxes where companies are allowed to experiment with different models and relax certain regulatory requirements to spur on innovation. I think you may see still some capital raising by way of the sale of tokens, maybe by way of some of the A+ and some of the crowd funding regulations, or just by way of private placements. Some compliance functions might be built into the tokens themselves. And I would just second you're going to see, public versus private and more private use cases, and some interesting interplay, Ripple being a great example, between true blockchains, really software implementations, and how they interrelate with various cryptocurrencies. So,
use of blockchain in mission-critical type applications like autonomous vehicles, where the autonomous vehicles record and transmit information regarding where they are, think about road conditions and things like that, and building those, what we call ontologies, and securing those ontologies, the data integrity of those ontologies with blockchain.
And I think there's going to be I think the SEC is actually going to do for the first time, or first time recently, a regulatory sandbox and try to be more forward-thinking in this space, because we are already seeing the evolution of this moving off out of the U.S., and I think they're recognizing they're going to be left behind. Thank you so much for coming and for listening.